Hi guys, Nathan from Buyers Club here. Today we're taking a look at Armadale in New South Wales, which is a market that we've been looking at for some time now. And it's a market that's starting to get more popular for investors amidst a bit of a general rise in interest across regional New South Wales at the moment. Sorry, just readjusting here. So we've put together this report using our AMAP framework, which stands for Advanced Market Analysis Protocol. And essentially, this is a system that we've designed to assess markets across the short, the medium, and the long term. Each timescale includes a few key metrics that we can assess across different markets so that our results are then both repeatable and comparable across different regions. And this timescale approach also offers us a bit of an insight into a market's current cycle position, as well as what the longer term prospects might be. Of course, nobody can precisely, perfectly predict the future. So, this is a probabilistic analysis. We're trying to understand just what the likely outcomes are for a market. But as you can see from the table here, we define short term as the next 0 to 2 years. And so within this category, we want to assess market momentum and liquidity. So are prices moving right now? How much are they moving? What depth is there to current market activity? Is the market highly liquid right now with very rapid turnover, or is it a bit more subdued? And then medium term, that looks out to 3 to 5 years, as you can see. And this is really where we begin to overlay more structural supply and demand factors like population growth, affordability, or housing supply, things that are still very important to the outcome of the market, but can take a little while to have their effects manifest in the market. And essentially, what we're asking here is, in light of whatever that short-term trend was that we're seeing, do these slower moving supply and demand factors point to that trend staying as it is, or are there signs that current market conditions will be more short-lived? Of course, we know that markets can be irrational, so there's often instances where you'll find a really hot market that probably doesn't have the underlying structure there to maintain that growth. And then long term, so out beyond 5 years, the big question there is structural risk, or will this market remain resilient through multiple market cycles? For example, a big question there is there sufficient diversity of industry here to survive a recession or poor economic conditions? Or is this a market that's really dependent upon only one or two key industries? So, of course, that can be a major risk signal for long-term resilience. And other big factors as well, like looking closely at proposed infrastructure investment, not only the level of that investment in overall dollar value, but also thinking a bit more qualitatively about what level of impact do we expect this to have upon the property market here. Uh, Next slide, sorry. So that's the process, but looking back at Armadale, you can see from our summary here that Armadale has demonstrated some really interesting results through this process. Across the short-term factors that we had a look at, Armadale has returned one of the best short-term scores that we've seen with 23 out of 25. Medium term was a bit more mixed, as you can see at 11 out of 25, and then long term was again very strong at 19 out of 25. And so, while these scores can be a bit of a useful at a glance litmus test, and some of them are very strong for Armadale, it does help to also examine the context behind them and take a deeper look at the data that's driving these scores. So, I'll move into looking at some charts and breaking down each of these three levels, but already a pretty fantastic result for Armadale. Next slide. Looking firstly at just raw house price levels in Armadale, you can see how the trajectory really changed in early 2022. Following a very slight contraction in price pre-COVID, the rate of growth here across this period post roughly 2019 has been significantly stronger, despite even this probably larger correction in 2023, which coincided with interest rate hikes. Since then, though, prices have now risen to record levels, having just recently touched the 600K mark. Next slide. Now, this is a slightly different measure of price growth on this chart. Here, we're looking not at prices themselves, but at the rate of growth. So the yellow line here is a 3-month rolling average of monthly price growth as a percentage. And the gray line is a 12-monthly rolling average of monthly price growth. So you can see that the fastest growth since 2010 took place in early 2020. And that was where 3-monthly average growth looks to have reached about 2.5%. So that's pretty incredible for prices to have been growing at an average of 2.5% a month. Either side of that spike, as you can see, there have been those two periods of contraction. As I said, where we did see negative price growth, but it is encouraging to see that these were both relatively short-lived and prices rebounded quite quickly. And looking more towards the recent end of this chart too, you can see that the short-term trend was lifting above the long-term measure of growth throughout most of 2024, which is sometimes an early indicator of building momentum. It has tapered off somewhat, now growing at about 0.5% per month. So it's probably pretty accurate to say that this is still an emerging market with some great signs of breaking up potentially soon towards hot market territory. Next slide. This is a good measure of liquidity here, days on market, which is exactly what it sounds like if you're not familiar with this metric. It's just the average number of days between a property being listed for sale and then being purchased or taken off the market. A lower number here is obviously better since it's a sign of more rapid turnover and high buyer demand. You can see that the trend over the past year is actually quite strong for Armadale. It's fallen from about a peak of roughly 70 days to less than half that now at just 30 days on market, which again is a very strong figure, especially for what is a bit of a smaller regional market. Next slide. Next chart, this is an interesting one as well. So here we're looking at the volume of property sales taking place in Armadale benchmarked against the wider state. So we're asking what share of New South Wales's total property sales have been happening in Armadale over time. You can see that over the long term, there's certainly been an obvious rise in popularity for Armadale. Previously, Armadale represented about 0.3% of New South Wales's property sales from about 2010 to 2012. Whereas now that has actually doubled to over 0.6% of the state's property transactions. And even taking a more short-term view of this as well, you can see that we're currently sitting above that long-term trend line. So very strong signs for liquidity in the market, but also growing popularity of Armadale over time relative to the rest of the state. Next slide. Inventory as well, similar to days on market, but this is measuring if no more homes were added to the market based on what the current activity is, how long would it take to sell every home that's currently listed? So this is measured in number of months. How many months would it take for every home to disappear from the market? Again, you can see a very clear decline in this figure, now down to only half a month of inventory in the market, down from over 1.5 months in the end of 2024. Next slide. Vacancy rates. I think most investors are pretty familiar with this one. It's another important one. Definitely in decline as well for Armadale, having now just touched 2%. Next slide. Moving on to medium-term metrics, which, as we said, were a bit more mixed. Population growth for a start. We're looking here at annual rate of population growth in Armadale, benchmarked to New South Wales in the darker color. Obviously, a bit of a consistent margin here between the two. I'd say ranging from about 0.5 to 1% in annual population growth. But That's not especially surprising for a regional market. At the very least, it is good to see mostly consistent population growth across the board, and only a couple of years of decline around COVID. Next slide. Housing supply. Here we are assessing the yearly rate of new household formation versus the rate of new dwellings constructed. And so, on a more simplistic level, of course, low supply is what drives prices in the short term, in isolation from other factors. But this is a retroactive look at supply levels over the past 4 years, during which there was a brief period of price decline, which means that it's hopefully now being absorbed as conditions improve, which may also help to sustain the more recent trend for longer, given that there is some accumulated supply available in the market. Next slide. Hold periods, nothing particularly great or alarming here. A bit of a slight upward trend, but mostly consistent at an average of about 8 years between property sales. Next slide. And last of all, for medium term unemployment, which for some time has broadly tracked New South Wales, which is great to see. But Armidale has recently undergone a very sharp contraction, down to now almost 2% unemployment, which is pretty fantastic, especially compared to the state as a whole. Now, finally, long term, and starting us off is one of the big ones I mentioned at the start, which is industry composition. You can see some really interesting data here regarding the share of employment in the region. Education and training, obviously the largest industry in Armadale by a significant margin. Of course, Armadale is home to the University of New England, and relative to Australia, as you can see there in the dark grey, this is obviously a very large dependence upon the education industry, but we would say that this is a low risk industry, which is actually quite a good sign for Armadale, unlike potentially concerning industries like agriculture, mining, or manufacturing, which can be highly dependent upon external economic factors or market cycles. Education tends to be a much more stable industry. It's got lots of public funding as well and quite steady demand. And the same goes for the number two industry here, which is healthcare. And the share of employment there is essentially on par with the national average. So quite a strong makeup here in terms of Armadale's local economy and industries of employment. Next slide. Looking now at household income growth over the last two censuses, it'll be great to get some new data from this year's upcoming census, but across 2016 to 2021, which is our most recent data, Armadale's median household income grew from $1,173 a week to 1,404, which was an increase of 19.69% across those years. While yes, this is slower than the state across the same period, you do expect income growth to be a tad slower in regional towns. So we would say this is within the realm of acceptability and not a particularly concerning result, factoring in the current price level for housing as well at just over 600K. This is still an area that is very affordable for its local residents. We know that most houses in Australia are owner occupied. So, in order for there to be strong price growth over the long term, it's vital that the residents in the market can actually afford to buy a house there themselves on the whole. And it's not just, out of state investors who are able to enter into the market. So, pretty healthy signs there in terms of affordability, definitely. Next slide. Economic growth is another really strong one. You can see this enormous disparity between Armadale's economic growth versus New South Wales's across 22 and 2023 in particular. While the gap has closed a little bit since then in 2024, which was our last full year of data that we have currently, Armidale was still outperforming New South Wales overall on a gross regional product basis, annual growth measure versus this measure of New South Wales's growth in overall gross state product. Next slide. So this one does look a little bit complex, but it's a pretty simple idea. Every census, the ABS puts out socio-economic scores for every local government area across the country. One of those scores is called ERSAD, which is a score from 1 to 10 based upon how wealthy or how affluent an area is. Higher scores meaning more affluent. So every dot shown here on this chart is a local government area. And you can see we've pointed out Armadale there with the black dot. And as of the most recent figures we have from the ABS, Armadale was scored as a very affluent market, really, with a score of 7. And especially looking at house prices as well along the horizontal axis here. At the time, there weren't many other places in the country besides Armadale that were both more affluent and had more affordable housing. So that's a really great sign for the demographics in the region, but also the interaction of how affluent the local residents are in the market and what the current price level was. Next slide. And last of all, we've got a summary here of some of the key infrastructure projects taking place in Armadale that we feel are likely to have a big impact upon the market. In terms of an overall figure, it's about $3 to $4 billion across the region in infrastructure investment, which is excellent, just on these key projects as well. Plenty of investment happening into road and highway infrastructure, some upgrades to the airport, the very large New England renewable energy zone, which is set to provide plenty of energy sector and construction employment across a 10-year period. And again, it's great to see that there's more investment happening into the university, which is definitely a key economic anchor for the town and a very reassuring signal in terms of long-term safety in this market. I'll just return to the summary slide for closing. So overall, some really strong signs for Armadale here across all of the data that we've looked at. It's presenting as a market with some very strong recent activity, but also a number of factors that point to a pretty excellent risk profile over the long term. That's it from this report on Armadale, though. If you have any questions on the data, the approach to our research, or even how this market might fit into your personal goals, feel free to reach out to the team. And of course, leave us a comment and let us know your thoughts. Thank you.